Come, walk down the winding path. Don't mind the spooks and monsters. They stay hidden within the trees. There are mysteries in this world that you need to know, and paranormal truths that need to be told. Come, step up into the caravan while we share tales of old, as well as new accounts about things you thought only existed in your nightmares. Welcome back inside the caravan. Tonight we will take you on a strange journey into the web of consciousness with our very special guest, MJ Banias. MJ is a theorist who critically and philosophically examines the weird. You can check him out on his own website, Terra Obscura, as well as his many contributions to the mysterious universe and Rogue Planet. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you very much for that.
No, it's an honor. I'm excited to be on here.
Oh, cool.
I'm happy to be one of the sort of the first guests on the show that's like solo with you. This is great.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So just to kind of jump right in, I will pose a question to you. It's a little long-winded. Here we go.
All right.
So if separation is an illusion, and we're all one, and if we're able to create our own realities, how does this span out into the universe? Is that part of what we've created? And could our collective consciousness create a veil between this world and the next?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we might need to sort of unpack a few things here. Because I think, when we think about the idea of let's say everyone being one or not, right? I think we need to first avoid, sort of the traditional problem we get into, right? Which is sort of the materialist interpretation that, I am not the table in front of me. Right.
Right.
Because ultimately, from a strictly biological sense or from a strictly physical sense, I'm not the table in front of me, right? If I burn this table, I don't feel what the table feels, or I'm not affected by the burning of the table, let's say, or breaking of it,
Right.
or resting my drink upon it. So I think when we examine or when we look at the idea of let's say separation or oneness, right? I think we need to maybe appreciate that there's sort of there's maybe different facets of this. So while physically the table and I are not the same, I think potentially there may be some subatomic connection between myself and the table, right? A subatomic connection between myself, the air around me, and then the air that interacts with the table. Potentially there's going to be, infinite amount of particles flying between us at all times. Or even sort of the building blocks of those particles, whether you sort of believe in string theory or some other sort of physical theory that would link everything.
Right.
But again, right, like on a real, just down to earth, realistic sort of standpoint, I am not the table. And same thing with like you and I, right? I'm not you, and you are not me, from any, I guess, sort of nuts and bolts, salt of the earth kind of explanation.
Right. That makes sense.
But I think, again, if we then think about sort of what consciousness is, and I think this is kind of where our argument maybe, or our conversation maybe needs to dwell a little bit, is we don't really know what consciousness is. There's a long sort of, and it's been around since the beginning of sort of philosophical thought. It's called the mind-body problem, right? And different philosophers have sort of weighed in, and scientists and everyone, psychologists, psychiatrists. And the issue is that we don't know where like the mind is inside the body, right? So there's no there's no like evidence that suggests that the mind there's no evidence that sort of points to where one's sort of consciousness is inside the brain or the body or whatever. So when we think about consciousness, we often think, well, it rests inside the brain, and it's just sort of there. The problem is that no one has ever been able to figure out the seed of that consciousness, right? No one's ever been able to figure out, well, if I do this or do that, if I poke this part of the brain or poke that part of the brain, I'm getting rid of that person's consciousness, or I'm altering that person's consciousness. There's no evidence to suggest that that's occurring, right? I can cut the cords, right? So I can, for example, give someone a lobotomy, but I'm not necessarily destroying their consciousness. We can cut the cables, let's say, and interfere with the connections, but we don't really know if we're actually destroying consciousness itself. So if you have someone, for example, who suffers permanent brain damage and they seem different to you, right, because of an accident, or let's say, a collision, or, getting shot in the head, whatever, you don't really know if that person's self is gone. All you know is that they can't communicate that self to you like they used to be able to, because all the wires have been sort of rearranged or damaged. So I think the big sort of philosopher that everyone talks about in this sort of realm is Carl Jung, who was a psychoanalyst and a student of Freud, and he kind of argued, consciousness itself is potentially unified, or at least the unconscious mind is unified. So on a day-to-day basis, you and I walk around, we buy coffee from Starbucks, and we go to work or whatever. Our conscious mind might not be unified, right? We have separate conscious thoughts. I don't know what you're thinking, and you don't know what I'm thinking. But Jung would say that potentially on an unconscious level, the background stuff that makes us all up is all one giant sort of web of interconnected. It's a one giant interconnected construct. Let's say I when I visualize it, I think of it like a giant spider web that goes in sort of all directions, not just sort of on a 2-dimensional plane, but like on a 3-dimensional plane. And we sort of all are sort of points or facets. Our conscious minds are sort of points and facets along this web, but what our conscious mind rests upon is this sort of unconsciousness that links everything. Everything that's conscious is linked together via this sort of unconscious web or unconscious network, let's say. And he was kind of the one who really sort of hit it home, and he has a lot of examples and sort of a lot of arguments as to why. And sort of his most common one is the idea of the myth or the archetype, right? He sort of argues that, if you look at cultures across the planet, especially ancient cultures that have never spoken to each other, have never communicated with each other, they all have sort of similar ideas of what it means to be human. They all have similar ideas of stories or story arcs that exist. All of their stories have similar sort of characteristics, or characters even with certain characteristics. So there's always going to be sort of the hero and the villain. There's always going to be sort of this representation of darkness as being bad, and the representation of light as being good. You're going to have characters that are sort of tricksters. You're going to have characters that are sort of shadow characters. You're going to have sort of the typical, the sort of the wise old mother or the wise old father figure. Like there's these archetypes that exist. And they exist universally. So Jung would probably argue, and I won't put words in his mouth, but he would probably argue, here's an example of human sort of interconnectedness, right? You have cultures that have evolved in totally different ways, yet they share similarities in sort of religious stories or creation stories or just sort of stories they tell around campfires. So that's sort of where we can maybe start our conversation. This idea that maybe something is connected that links all of us. What we choose to call it, I don't know, but there's an interconnectedness to all things, let's say.
It's interesting because when you put it that way, it's like you can't prove, as far as I know, that we have a spirit inside of us moving us around. So what if the consciousness is specifically part of spirit? So that's why you can't find it? Does that make sense?
So and I think you're sort of dabbling in the right area, right? I mean, for the longest time, most religions will often argue, you have a soul, let's say, or a spirit, right? Is the term, right? Especially in sort of the Judeo-Christian sort of tradition of a sort of theology, right? People have souls or spirits. I think we're sort of
Right.
talking about the same thing here. I think, again, one's spirit or soul, from if we sort of look at this from a totally sort of secular standpoint, if we just, let's not talk about sort of specific religious ideology or dogma, but if we just talk about sort of just on a purely secular level, your mind or your soul are probably the same thing, right? It's that which is you, right, inside your body, or outside of your body potentially, right, depending on your religious tradition, right? Your soul can exist outside of your body, depending on sort of what you believe in, I guess. But yeah, I think that's kind of the same thing, like when you talk about the soul or the spirit or the mind or consciousness or your identity, the you-ness within you, for sure, that would sort of be a good way of looking at it.
Okay, yeah.
So, I mean, so you sort of in your first question, you sort of asked about like sort of seeing beyond some sort of veil. So, what do you mean by that?
Like the veil when it comes to, all this paranormal stuff that I'm just trying to see that spider web and how everything is connected. If things vibrate just on different planes, or if our collected consciousness kind of created a veil between us and others,
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that we need to sort of think of it that there's a veil. Let's say I think going back to Jung, he wrote an essay. It's a very long essay, but it's an essay on sort of flying saucers. And he goes into UFOs and he talks about the idea of people seeing UFOs. And his theory is that that the UFO is that unconscious mind, that unconscious hive mind, right? Like the web, sort of projecting the anxieties and the fears and the desires of all of us into sort of into our visions or into things we see. So people see UFOs in the sky, not because there's sort of an objective UFO there necessarily, but they see UFOs in the sky because the unconscious mind is projecting that into their consciousness. So they're seeing it. Where Jung starts to kind of stumble a little bit, and he sort of admits to this, is he says, what we don't understand is what happens when you have more than one person see a UFO. So does that mean then the unconscious mind is projecting that UFO to multiple consciousnesses that are, in the same place at the same time? So if you have, like the Phoenix Lights incident is an example where you had like thousands of people see UFOs, does that mean that the unconscious mind is projecting the same image or the same sort of series of images across 1,000 people who are sort of present in the same area? That for Jung is like, he's at that point, he's like, I don't know, right? This is
right.
We prove all the time that people see things that aren't there, and it's a projection of their unconscious mind, he would say, like from a psychoanalyst standpoint, like that's normal, right? People have psychoses. But once you start getting into sort of mass psychoses, there are events where this has occurred. But again, it's kind of, now you're kind of getting into kind of murky water here. Like, how do we sort of prove that? And then, Jung even goes further and he says, what happens if that UFO, let's say, leaves a physical trace, like landing marks, or it shows up on a radar? This is now something completely wild and crazy, he would say, because ultimately, can the mind then project something into like an objective state? So if I think it, can it become true, right?
Right. So
I think sort of a common version of this is something like a tulpa, if you know what that is, from sort of certain... Yes. Yeah. So if someone can think about something hard enough, let's say, if someone can concentrate and focus, can they make their thoughts become physically real? That is sort of the big question. And that's predominantly what a tulpa is, right? It's it's something that does not exist physically, manifesting physically, that it can walk around and open doors and bump into things. And again, Jung would be like, I don't know at that point. But, again, if we sort of think about, if we really want to go speculate, like if we want to really start speculating outwards, right? We could probably say, a lot of paranormal activity isn't necessarily objectively real. It's not actually existing out there. Like there is no, let's say, Bigfoot walking around in the woods, or there is no ghost that haunts that house, objectively, in the sense that if suddenly all humanity disappeared, would that ghost still be there? would
Oh,
Bigfoot
wow, right.
still be there, right? Or rather, are we ourselves creating Bigfoot? Are we ourselves creating the ghost? Are we ourselves creating those monsters that go bump in the night? But because we think about them, because there's enough of us thinking about them, are we making them real to the point where they can knock on trees or knock on doors, or they can haunt and move things around in your home, objectively, right?
Right.
Yeah, are you giving sort of form to something that doesn't have form? But because you believe in it, because you are able to sort of tulpa it, maybe you're making that ghost manifest, let's say.
For a long time, I've always believed that, so everything's made up of energy, even our thoughts. And so the more energy that you put into something, the more likely then that it's created, and it goes to the spiritual side of things of being these great manifestors of our own reality.
Yeah, and I mean, people are going to have problems with this. Like, this isn't one, like, sort of the materialist science is going to definitely say, well, this is nonsense, right? Because you can't prove that to be true, right? Like,
Right.
there's no laboratory that's going to be able to sort of prove this to be the case, which is fine. I mean, and then on the other side, I think you're going to have people within maybe the paranormal community who would have problems with this. So,
Right.
for example, I think especially within ghost hunting circles, right? I've spoken to a lot of ghost hunters, and I often ask the question. I say, like, how do you know it's the spirits of the dead? Like, how do you know it's dead people, right?
Right.
Like, and what I mean by that is, how do you know that it's someone died, their spirit left their body or whatever, their mind left their body, their consciousness left their body, and now is sort of back haunting, like a traditional sort of ghost, right? And they would say, well, all the evidence points to that. Twitch, I'm just like, okay, well, what evidence do you really sort of fundamentally have? Just because they say they're dead? Like, I'm not necessarily sure if that's evidence. I mean, how do you know you're not projecting that, and it's your interpretation that is making that manifestation say that?
Right.
Because
Wow.
ultimately, you don't have the chicken or the egg in this case. The ghost is doing what it wants, or you're making the ghost do what it wants. And if it's going to just say I'm dead, ultimately you're, so I don't know. It's interesting. So you're gonna have people on both sides. Like, you're gonna have the Bigfoot hunters being like, "What are you talking about?" Like, when I go to the woods hunting Bigfoot, you're saying there is no Bigfoot. Like, yeah, there is no Bigfoot.
Oh
Bigfoot
yeah. They'll
Bigfoot
sit there
shows
and be
up.
like, "How did I just magically make this thing, that's 6 foot tall and
Yeah.
heard, No, I know. And see, that's the biggest thing that I enjoy though about doing the podcast and talking to people in the community is I am really, I don't want to get stuck in either camp. What I like to do is play with what if. Like, just, think about things and go with it for fun,
Yeah.
on both sides.
Yeah, no, and like, this is not necessarily something sort of I believe in sort of wholeheartedly, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about, because I think it forces us to maybe reconsider a few of our assumptions. I think the paranormal sort of community, and I'm going to lump sort of everyone, like, that's, whatever esoteric paranormal stuff you believe in, right? Whether it's UFOs or Bigfoot or ghosts or, Loch Ness monster, or I don't know what else people believe in, Mothman, whatever. If you really lump sort of the big paranormal subculture community together, we really, what people think they know, they don't know, right? They just
Right.
think they know it, or this is what I was told, or this is how I was taught, or this is what other people think.
Right.
Unfortunately, there's no evidence really to support much of it, or any of it. There's no evidence to support, UFOs are caused by aliens. There's no evidence to support that ghosts are dead people. There's as much evidence to support that, Jung's theory of unified consciousness is what causes ghosts, as there is to say it's dead people, right? There's no real evidence that like, none outweighs the other, right?
Right.
I think people just sort of have, for the longest time, said ghosts are dead people. Therefore, we believe ghosts are dead people. And yeah, they just sort of roam around for some reason.
It's really interesting thinking of it this way, because there was an experience that I had with my daughter. My grandfather, he passed away in 2011. And when I was a kid, he would come home from the grocery store, and there was those little, 5-cent toy machines that it would pop out this little egg, and there'd be
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, dinosaurs inside of it. So he would go to the store and he'd come back home and he would hide these dinosaurs in his pocket, and then he'd just pull them out at these random times. Well, it's not something that I really, I don't know, talk about. There's no reason to really bring it up. And then my daughter, gosh, she was probably about 5 years old or so.
Mhm.
And she comes up to me and she says, Papa Don has dinosaurs in his pocket. And of course, at that moment, because we had lost him and everything, I just, broke into pieces and everything. But it's interesting because then going back to what you said about the unified unconsciousness,
Mhm.
it like I'm curious how she is it that pool that she was able to just tap into and like get a memory from it, or
Yeah, I mean, okay, so yeah, first of all, we don't really know how it works, right? If it
right.
exists at all, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
we don't really know how it works. So let's say someone, and I think again we can sort of speculate here, right?
Uh-huh.
Maybe it is like a pool in that some people are just better able at tapping into that sort of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
and they can perceive things and they don't necessarily know why they perceive them, almost like precognition, right?
Right.
In this case, it would be more of just like, I don't know, like a post cognition or a present cognition. I don't know, but ultimately you'd be dealing with sort of this idea that the person simply just pulls a piece of information out, and then
Right.
just has it. Much like how precognition works, right? It's not like
Hmm.
precognition is um, you can practice, I suppose, but ultimately you're just sort of there, you're just sitting there, and all of a sudden an idea comes into your head, um,
Right.
and then you're like, oh yeah, okay, and then you kind of run with it. So maybe she somehow accessed, let's say, the pool.
Right.
Um, we could also potentially suggest is just because someone's consciousness is no longer sort of physically present, so they have a body, but they've died, let's say, does that mean then that their consciousness leaves the web, right,
Ooh.
of sort of the unconscious mind, right? So are they
Right.
then maybe existing within that unconsciousness? Do they then enter that web as whatever? Um,
Mm.
and again, from like a Judeo-Christian perspective, right? We would sort of refer to this as heaven or the afterlife. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what's to say that heaven is sort of a physical place, and not necessarily a sort of state of mind. And
Mm.
literally by state of mind, I mean, the mind itself exists with its own sort of state,
Mm-hmm.
and is sort of connected to the rest of consciousness itself, which would
Right.
maybe answer potentially a few sort of ghost stories or a few sort of ideas concerning ghosts, right? If that mind is still sort of milling about, can it not
Mm-hmm.
manifest itself, right? Via, appearing to you,
Ooh.
let's say. Again,
Right.
not sort of objectively there necessarily, but you see it. Um,
Right.
Again, where things get weird is where, it starts to manipulate with reality. And that's a whole other conversation. Like it starts to manipulate physically with things. That's a whole other
Right.
sort of conversation that I think we can address. But, um, you know, I don't know. Whatever is happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's say the unconscious mind is real. This is one I've always sort of wondered about. If let's say this unconscious web exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it limited, let's say, to our sort of universal state, or if as quantum physics is starting to sort of really dig into this idea of the multiverse, right, where there's an infinite amount of universes, are we also connected with ourselves in other universes, right? So
Mm-hmm.
is my unconscious mind connected to myself in every other parallel universe that exists, all infinite of them?
Mm.
So then in your daughter's case, maybe she was interacting with, this was your father, your
My
grandfather.
grandfather.
Maybe she was perhaps somehow interacting with your grandfather sort of in another state of another one of these parallel universes, let's say, and then
Wow.
um, it's simply because it's all connected, right? She was able to tap
Right.
into that idea, because your grandfather would carry dinosaurs in his pocket in an infinite amount of universes. So
That sounds cool.
right. So again, right, like we can really speculate. This is all speculation. Like there's no evidence for any of this. This is all just a bunch of, philosophical rambling. But it's interesting to consider, our options here, which is kind of what we're doing.
Right.
Or I'm totally wrong. Like I could be totally wrong, and there is sort of an afterlife that's very literal. His spirit came down and informed her to, there's dinosaurs in my pocket. I need those now, please. Because the Brontosaurus is really important to me. I don't know, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's tough to reconcile because ultimately, like I'm sort of born, raised, and I'm practicing Catholic. So for me, I have to really reconcile my sort of my faith, let's say, as a person, and then sort of my philosophical compartmentalization of like stuff that could potentially also be happening. So
Right.
I don't know. I think where things get interesting, and I think that this, if people who hunt ghosts are listening to the show right now, they're going to be like, well, what about EMF meters, and what about when the ghost pushes me?
Right.
This is sort of where things get really interesting. There's a great he's a professor of theology, I think. His name is Jeffrey Kripal. He's written a couple books. He's terrific, and he's very interesting in the way he sort of interprets what we sort of call the imaginal realm, or the imaginal. So he sort of argues, I guess, to really sort of simplify it, is in one of his essays he talks about monsters, the idea of the monster, and he says, we sort of seem to separate the idea that something is sort of objectively real and then sort of imaginary, right? So when we're kids, we're sort of told when we're little kids that the boogeyman is real. So to us as a little kid, there is a boogeyman hiding under my bed, or a monster hiding under my bed. And to me as a kid, it's objectively there. I'm afraid to get out of my bed and go look because I know it's there. And as we get older, we realize that, there is no monster under the bed. It's purely in our imagination. It can't hurt us, right? It does not exist in a real sense that at least we sort of understand to be real. Kripal says, why do we think this is the case? Like, why do we think that there has to be a distinction between something that's objectively real, like a table, and something that's imagined and inside your mind, like a monster? And he argues that in sort of monster stories where people have experienced monsters, whether they've seen Bigfoot, whether they've experienced aliens, whether they've seen ghosts, or whether they've, had interactions with a Mothman or whatever.
Right.
He says it's pretty short-sighted to say that the two are separate things, like objective and subjective. He says rather maybe they exist in this sort of it's more of a spectrum, in that if enough people or there's enough thought about the monster becomes objectively real. But when no one's paying attention to the monster, when the monster's sort of forgotten about, the monster no longer exists, or at least it's just in the imagination. We can sort of say, I'm sitting in this room right now and there's no Mothman in here. So he exists in some imaginal realm for me. He's part of my imagination. But if I'm somewhere and there's sort of enough, I don't want to say thinking about the Mothman, but there's enough, I guess, drive to make the Mothman manifest, the Mothman becomes objectively real, in the sense that he can land on my car and leave dent marks on it. And the idea of him being real or not real is not two separate things, but it's one connected idea that's a spectrum, rather than, and there's no break between the two. So there can be shades of realness or objectivity and shades of subjectiveness and sort of subjectivity. So, you hear these stories all the time of the Mothman standing in front of me, and I can, his eyes are staring into me and I'm scared, and I can even smell him, right? He has an odor, and then he turns and he leaps off the building, and I run to the edge and I don't see him anymore. Right.
Right.
It's because the Mothman has left objective reality for you and for everyone. He's not hiding. He's just gone, right?
Right.
And we have this in UFO cases all the time, where people see UFOs, and it's right there in the sky, and it's like they're like, oh my god, and they turn their eyes for a second, they look back, and it's gone, right? Or the UFO is just there, and then it just disappears from view, right? So the idea that it's both sort of objective and subjective simultaneously. And you can have multiple people seeing it because it's subjective for that brief moment. It shows up on radar, or it can leave landing marks on the ground, or burn marks on a tree. Because for that moment, it was real. And then it's gone. And Kripal would say, we shouldn't have a distinction between the two, because there's no evidence to suggest there should be a distinction.
Right. Yeah, see, it reminds me of Linda Godfrey's book, Monsters Among Us. There's a case in there where there was the Dogman type prints in the snow, and then it just disappeared.
The Dogman did, or the prints did?
The prints did.
Yeah, and that's, right?
Yeah.
So,
it's crazy.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, because then I think it answers a lot of loopholes, right? I think it fills a lot of loopholes. I mean, it really addresses then why no one can ever get a decent shot at Bigfoot, right?
Right.
And why, anyone who's ever said they did shoot Bigfoot and killed them can never produce evidence to say that, well, here's the body, right?
See, this line of thinking for me makes everything almost more scary. There was a movie that I watched with my kids, and it was kind of like a Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark kind of movie.
Classic. Yeah.
Right? And the title of it was Don't Think About It. Because there was this book, and it was talking about this monster, but it said specifically, if you don't think about it and you don't worry about it, you'll be safe. And of course, what happens? The little kid, he thinks about it, and it like, you watch this thing, it grows and grows until it's finally there,
Yeah.
And that would be really terrifying, because then it doesn't matter whether it's a, I don't know, known cryptid, like Bigfoot or whatever. That means that anything could just happen. Any monster that you could possibly think up, you could just, boom, create it into being.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Maybe, again, this is, I mean, we're speculating here, but it's also interesting, though, when you really think about, like our society, in North America, we're so occupied by things, right? Like, we govern our lives with things, our cell phones, our laptops, our cars. We go to Starbucks. We work our day jobs. We watch Netflix at night. Like, we're so plugged into the material world. Not only that, but like, our objects that we possess, our possessions. Generally, we don't see strange or frightening things. We don't make monsters because we don't need to, right? We've sort of governed our time in such a way that we don't allow the monsters to exist, at least for us. It's the monsters come when you're not occupied, right? The monsters come when your schedule is all off. The monsters come when you exist in a state of chaos or marginalization, or you're under heavy stress, or you've lost your job, or a family member, or you're alone in the woods at night. That's really when the monsters come, right? When you really look at the vast majority of let's say UFO stories, a person's typically alone. Right. A person, oftentimes in UFO events, something is going on in their life that has thrown their life kind of out of whack a little bit. They're experiencing some sort of stress, or they're in between something, right? They just lost their job, or they think their marriage is on the rocks, or they're somewhere different, right? They're not at home, or they're in a new home that they just moved into. And the same things with ghost stories, right? A lot of ghost stories have similar, where people often say, we're doing home renovations, and people say ridiculous things like the home renovations have upset the spirit, because dead people give a shit about your tiles. But But it's not necessarily that, right? It's
Right.
the fact that your home is a mess, right? Like you're living in a state now where your place of comfort, where you get away from the monsters, um,
Right.
is in a state of disarray.
Mm-hmm.
So that allows the monsters to come in, right? Um, it's interesting, I think, when if you really looked at a lot of people's sort of monster stories, and I tie UFOs and ghosts into the general term for monster. I think if you look at people's monster stories, I think people are often who experience these monsters are in a certain sort of place where they're uncomfortable, whether they're anxious or afraid or depressed or whatever. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's when the monster sort of is able to, not the monster itself, but that's when the mind begins to create the monster, whatever it is,
Right.
right? And that's why they're also cultural, right? Like it's not like like I'm in Winnipeg, so north. I'm in Canada. I'm not going to see a chupacabra running around,
Right.
because it's not part of my sort of it's not part of my ideological background. Like chupacabras
Right.
are not something that are part of my sort of my mythology within my landscape, or the mythology within my sort of geography, right? We don't have
Right.
these sort of desert monsters. you know um
Exactly.
yeah, I would see something else potentially,
Yeah.
that maybe is a little more local to sort of the mythology around my area.
Right. And it's interesting because as you're saying all this, thinking back to my personal experiences that I've had since I was a kid, each time, and it takes a little bit to really think about it because it seriously seems like there's been so much. Each time something happened, there definitely was something going on.
Mhm.
Whether I was fighting with my parents, um, just experiencing a general depression. One of my biggest experiences that I had was foolishly I had made a Ouija board and I was messing around with that. And then, I could have definitely created the experience after that, but I remember laying in bed and there was just this really dark figure that stood next to my bed. And I remember feeling like I was held down, like there was an actual hand on my leg.
Mhm.
But and it's interesting too because since I was a kid, I've seen a lot of. I always laugh and I call them Nazgul looking shadow figures.
Mhm.
Um, the most interesting thing about that is the fact that I experienced that since I was young, and then I found out that my sister had experienced it too,
Mhm.
but I hadn't told her about it. And then fast forward to having my kids, and of course, it's not something that I really tell them. They hadn't known about it. And then one morning, one of them was like, "Mommy, there was this standing in the corner of your bedroom." And she described it exactly like what I had seen. And then
Mhm.
my sister, her stepson, also experienced something like that in his room.
Right.
And so it'd be interesting. I'll have to see what was going on in her life too when she experienced it if there was trouble, you know?
For sure. And I mean, I'm not sure there's also sort of one answer to all this. I mean, ultimately, some of
Hmm.
your experiences or some of your daughter's experiences and your friend's son, your sister's son experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sister, stepson.
Right. You don't know necessarily how much of that is sort of necessarily directly, let's say, caused by some sort of monster phenomena, or how much of it is imagination because,
Hmm.
maybe they've overheard you talking about it, or they saw a movie. Like there could be cultural reference points
Exactly.
as well, right? That's just because somebody may see something or have sort of a frightening experience, or have a dream or whatever. Again, we also exist within sort of a very, obviously sort of media rich culture. Um,
Hmm.
and only that, your parents talk about stuff, and you overhear it, and it just kind
Yes.
of slips into your mind, and all of a sudden it just sits there, and then 5 days later it, you know,
Yes,
manifests in some
exactly.
weird way. Right. So I think it's a combination of all these things. I think, there's no sort of grand solution to all of it. I think, everyone's going to have that experience of seeing something strange, and it could just be the imagination, right? Like not every single person who has an experience with something strange is actually having like an experience with something strange.
Right.
And some people who have experiences with something strange all the time, like legitimately, may also just, also have imaginary ones too. I mean, we all do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think I think it's pretty complex. But
Yeah.
in the case of your particular sightings, or sightings may not be the right word, experiences. um,
Yeah.
Obviously some of them definitely, I wasn't there, so I don't know, and I can't tell you, what the
Right.
reality is. But recognizing that, often, life is in a state of disarray, and then there's sort of a reaction to that, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
manifests in some way. It's interesting. It would be really interesting to think, though, and this is where things get weird, is when it comes to, let's say, the monster, right?
Uh-huh.
So let's just use the example of like the Mothman, for example, because
Okay.
he's been a pretty hot topic in Chicago.
Yeah.
So let's assume that our speculations are true, that
Mm-hmm.
Kripal's right, and that there is no disconnect between something being objectively real, like a table, and something being subjectively sort of imaginal,
Mm-hmm.
like you thinking about unicorns. If the
Okay.
Mothman exists somewhere along the spectrum, does
Mm-hmm.
that mean the Mothman, though, has a mind of his own, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the weird thing. So when somebody experiences Mothman, and they think about it and it becomes real, and then Mothman disappears and he comes back later somewhere else, is it the
Mm-hmm.
same Mothman, right? Like, and
Right.
does the Mothman have a mind, in the sense that he remembers all those experiences and he understands himself to be both real and not real? Or does he not know? Does he
Mm.
think he's real, and he just sort of pops in and out of existence, right? And he just doesn't know.
Wow.
You know what I mean? Like, are we basically creating a whole bunch of Mothmen, right?
Right.
That they're born and they die immediately, right? With that experience.
Mm.
I see the Mothman, there he is. He jumps off the building and flies away, and he disappears. Mothman's dead, and then another one gets made, right? Or
Wow.
is it the same Mothman, right? In the sense that
Mm-hmm.
it's the same. He has a mind of his own, let's say. And we can talk about Bigfoot for this. We can talk about the UFO for this. We can talk about sort of any sort of monster. Um,
Wow.
do they do they have their own minds within this creation system?
Mm.
That's really interesting to think about. Um,
Yeah. Wow.
because if they
You
do,
know,
you can't shoot them then. No, I'm just joking.
um, so I know before, and I'm kind of going off topic here, but kind of not. Before, when we were going to have you on, we were going to talk about Injured Cold. And
Hmm.
so I'm just curious where, because I haven't been able to do a lot of research on him or anything yet.
Yeah.
Uh, where does he fall on this spectrum? Is he also something that you think that could be just created with the mind and then go
Right.
away
Yeah.
and then come back?
It's interesting, right? Because the guy who sort of, I guess, first bumped into the Injured Cold phenomenon,
Uh,
was what's his name? Something
Bro.
Woodburger or something like that. So he's a sewing machine salesman or something. Um,
Mhm.
he had sort of multiple experiences, or at least he had alleged multiple experiences. And again, it depends who you ask or who you talk to. Some people say, maybe the initial experience was real, and then
Mhm.
everything thereafter was sort of made up,
Mm.
because he got press attention for it, and Keel talked to
Right.
him, and it was a big deal. So he decided to write. Okay, he wrote a book about Injured Cold, and like allegedly this guy gets taken by Cold to his home planet, and Cold is allegedly this alien, from another world, and he gets to visit with these people, and they're all wonderful and peaceful people, and they live these righteous, beautiful lives. And then even his daughter wrote a book, about
Wow.
how the family had experiences with these other people from the same sort of planet. I think it's called like Linulia or something like that. I don't remember
Oh,
off the top of my
okay.
head. It's been so long since but um, so the daughter then writes a book as well, sort of years later,
Right.
and she talks about these experiences too, and how her family and she's gone to this planet and visited
Oh,
these
wow.
people and whatever. So the original Injured Cold story from
Uh-huh.
the first guy who actually saw it's sort of ridiculous. Like when you actually like read the book, and you sort of go through it, you kind of, depending on I guess your interpretation, you sort of look at it as, one, the guy's just totally making all this up and it's total nonsense, or he is having some sort of series of, like, psychotic episodes where he thinks this is happening, and he's writing it all down, or he's like on acid, or it's like real, right? And there's a planet where there's these people who have strange grins and they wear funny clothing, like the people in the Wizard of Oz, and like, because it's so fantastical, right? Like, it's so and it seems so contrived, right? Like, by today's standards, you read that book and you're like, this is silly, right? Like, because again, this guy was writing this book and he was sort of talking about sort of slightly futuristic technology, but he's talking about from a standpoint in the 1960s, right? So he's making predictions about where technology is going and what these people are like, and he's like way off, right? Like, like no one uses like steam powered, spaceships,
right?
So it seems ridiculous. I think if you look at, though, the injured cold phenomenon strictly sort of from Keel's interpretation, and this is where things are interesting, because a lot of us sort of don't want to go down the guy's interpretation because it seems so silly. But if you stick with Keel and you kind of go through his stuff and his interpretation of injured cold, he does talk a little bit about sort of the alienness of him, as if he is some sort of alien being. But he talks about a lot more, that there's like a direct connection between him and the Mothman, as if they're part of the same phenomena.
Right.
The Mothman isn't cold, according to Keel, and cold isn't the Mothman. But they're almost part of the same, like almost like part of the same mythology, or the same mythological sort of coin, right? If Mothman is sort of the frightening beast, cold is sort of the polite, sort of Dr. Jekyll, right? To the Mr. Hyde that is the Mothman. Because they kind of show up at similar times. There's been stories as well. I think this was actually in the daughter's book. She makes the claim that Cold was he was like chasing the Mothman. Not because the Mothman was bad, but I don't know, like they were just like going after him for some reason, tracking him down or whatever. So the Mothman was running from them, and that's why he showed up on our world and sort of the reconnaissance guy to go after him. Like again, there's so many ridiculous stories, right, where this Cold idea comes from. So, and again, right, you almost don't want to believe, like, you almost don't want to go down the path of the family that had experiences with this guy, because you're like, it just seems so silly. But I think Injured Cold is also kind of frightening in a sense, right? He carries this sort of this strange grin, and he speaks in this strange way, and even his name is quite eerie, and has, like, even when you say his name, right, like,
it's spooky.
It compels something, right? Like it's such an odd collection of sounds, and just the phrases are so symbolic and they mean so many different things. You're like, holy crap. And I think that for me, Injured Cold, at least when I wrote the blog post that sort of was the start of that conversation, so many months ago, or years ago, I guess, a year ago, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll find it and I'll put it on the
for me, it was an odd moment of I guess synchronicity and sort of tricksterism, in that it was sort of came up, and I was just in a certain place in my life where not just strange things were happening, but I was just sort of having like these odd moments of people communicating with me or talking to me and messaging me or calling me, and then this guy's name popping up a whole bunch of times, and then like Seth Breedlove giving me a copy of his film to review, about the Mothman, and then it popped up right there, and I was sitting there being like, holy crap, what the hell's going on? Like, how is this happening to me right now? So I decided to write an article just about how my interpretation maybe of the UFO phenomenon was shifting drastically from sort of something sort of concrete and physical to something maybe a little more subjective and something a little more odd and trickstery, let's say.
Right.
Yeah.
So just an off question for you. just because I'm curious. I also asked Ryan when he was live, and it's so interesting. If you ended up, if somebody came to you, let's say the government or somebody of stature that was in the know, came up to you and was like, "Hey, aliens and UFOs are 100% real,"
Right.
and you had, I mean, the proof, it's right there. They take you, but you can never speak about it
Right.
ever.
Mhm.
What would you do from that point on with all the stuff that you do and that you're interested in? I mean, where would you go from there?
Right. So, okay, so we're assuming I believe everything I'm seeing?
Yes.
Like this is not some big hoax that I'm being.
Right. Like you can physically, you can touch it. They've showed you the proof. I mean, everything is 100%.
Yeah. Um. Okay, so do I have an option here, or it's like I have to see it and I cannot talk about it, or do I have?
Ooh. You have, sure, yes, you have the
So if,
option. They say, would you like to see this?
but in exchange, you can't talk about it,
Right.
or you don't see it and that's it.
Yep.
Yeah, man, that's tough. Yeah. Uh, huh. Well, yeah. I mean, one, you'd have to trust the government. I would also say that it would really depend on what they're showing me, right? Because my argument would be that there is no like when I think about UFOs, I don't necessarily think that we're dealing with like extraterrestrials from another planet. Like we're not necessarily dealing with like space aliens. Like I don't necessarily think that's what's the cause of the UFO phenomenon. So again, if they showed me like an alien body and and it was 100% real, would I sort of sit there and be like, okay, this is 100% proof that concludes that this is what is causing UFOs, or are UFOs something else, and this is just one thing, right? Is this one aspect of the phenomenon, a dead alien? But UFOs are actually like other things. You know what I mean?
Right.
God, it's such a tough question. What did Ryan say?
He said, let's see if I can remember right. I think he said that, because see, he didn't have the option though. He didn't have the option to
Okay,
see it
so
or
let's say
not see it.
okay. So what was his answer then? Because okay, let's say I don't have an option anymore. I have to. Like I get dragged into Area 51 or something.
I think that he would. I think what he, if I remember correctly, and he can correct me if I'm wrong. I think he said that he would see it and take in the information, but I think he said he wouldn't be able to hold back that information.
Right, but you have to as part of this deal.
Right. I think that he would have just agreed to it and then but he would still continue to do what he does now.
Right. But okay, so I'm allowed to do that. I can basically just lie to them and say, yeah, I won't say anything, and then I'm just gonna say anything. Like,
Well, that was his decision. You have you have to make your own choice. You don't
but
know
the
that.
rules are changing. The rules are changing mid game here, Jenny. If I can do that, then I'll do that. Like, if I don't know, if it was like they put an implant in my head so that anytime I think about aliens, I get an electric shock,
Oh
then
goodness.
that's different. I'll be honest, I don't know. I don't have an answer for you because it seems so out there that it would never happen.
Right.
I don't know. It's a good
Again, it's the
question
what if. It's you know, yeah, I like to play with the what ifs.
for sure. And yeah, I don't know. I, I I can't answer your question. I don't know what I would do. I think if I knew the answer, like let's say if somebody said, "Here's the answer to like the UFO riddle. Here it is,"
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and it was perfect. Like it was like this beautiful, perfect solution, right? That was so elegant. I think I'd probably just be like, okay, cool. And then I would go to my cabin and I would live out there for the rest of my life. And I would never come back. You know what I mean? Like I would be like, oh, there's the answer, right? I mean, it's like
Yeah.
that X-Files episode that just came out, right? Where the alien gives them the book. Um, are you watching the new season of X-Files?
I want to. I haven't been able to yet, but
Okay.
it's not going to spoil anything for me,
No,
so
no,
it's
it
all.
won't because there's this one goofy. It's a goofy like fake. It's not real. Like it doesn't happen. But anyway, this alien
Okay.
shows up and it's quite a silly moment. And he hands them this book and says, "This is the answer to everything." Like if you're looking for the truth that's out there, it's in this book. And they hand him this book. And obviously, Mulder's like, it's all here. This is useless, and he falls down crying because, they have the answer.
Right.
That's what it would be, right? Like suddenly the hunt is over. So what's the point?
Right. Ooh. That is one of the things is a couple years ago, I can't remember I can't remember what they're called. But those rocks that would move across the desert and they never knew why until recently?
No. I've never heard of it.
Okay, well I'll have to look it up, but it was just another one of those world mysteries that
Okay.
they just and they would leave these lines in the
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
So they figured out why it does it.
Why does it do it?
I don't remember.
Oh, okay. Damn it.
I know. This is just a thought that just popped up in my head. But sometimes it's really disappointing to find out the reason why behind stuff. If they were to just say, "Hey, the Bermuda Triangle, it's simply this."
Right.
Yeah, I think that there are things that I don't want to know because I want to feel spooked. I want to feel mystified.
Right. There's a great Simpsons episode. You watch Simpsons?
Yes, I've seen them.
This is classic. So Homer gets an X-ray or whatever, and they find a crayon lodged in his brain, and it's been there since he was a little kid. So the doctors remove the crayon, and he suddenly becomes like insanely intelligent, right?
Right.
And he's very smart. He's not the oaf he was, right? And he starts walking around, and at one point he goes up to Flanders, his neighbor, and he hands him a piece of paper and says, I did you the favor on this paper. I've proven that God doesn't exist, right? And he hands him this piece of paper, and there's like, we don't know what's on it. We never see it, but there it is, the solution, right? Like this is evidence that God does not exist. And Flanders, all he does is like, well, can't let this get out. So he literally crumples the piece of paper up and eats it, right?
Oh, nice.
Right. And it's so accurate, right? I mean,
yeah.
Flanders sort of takes one for the team and is like, well, we can't let people see this. So he destroys it. It's very funny. The episode ends with Homer shoving something. They put the crayon back on purpose.
Right.
So that Homer becomes himself again. But it's very much like that, right? Imagine just sort of having the answer to everything. You would regret it. I think you would wish you hadn't, because the mystery's gone, like you say, right? The hunt is over. I agree with you there.
So okay. so then that makes me ask or think of another question. Two things. If there was one mystery in the world, anything that you could pick from that you definitely want to know, you would not feel disappointed at all. Number one, what would that be? And number two, what would be the one mystery you just absolutely do not want the answer to?
Oh man, like ever?
Like ever, because you want to keep that mystery, right, that spook feeling.
Ever assumes I'm alive. Like if I die,
Yeah,
I want that. Okay. Oh man. Okay, so I would say, yeah, I think it's my personal interest. So I would say, I think a mystery for me that, like, while I'm alive, that I would want to know, that wouldn't sort of ruin life, maybe, would be potentially like the whole UFO paranormal. Like, is it all connected, and is it aliens or is it not aliens? Just tell me what it is, right?
Right.
If there is one, like if there's one grand unification of like the phenomena, right? What is that? That would be, because at the end of the day, I'll be honest, if suddenly like UFOs left my life, like I could move on, right? Like I'd find another hobby. Because I find it academically interesting, but it's not like it governs my life. I enjoy talking about it, but I wouldn't say like I'm all consumed. I'm writing a book, so right now I'm all consumed, but once that book's published, forget it. I think what I wouldn't want to know is like the big question, like why are we here? Like,
Oh.
like I wouldn't want to know how the universe operates. I don't think, not while I'm alive, because I think that would drive you crazy. Like I think if you knew how the universe like actually worked to the point where like you had like the intelligence of God, that would really
Right.
mess you up. Because you're still human. So
Yeah.
I would wait until if I'm dead, and then
Mhm.
God shows up and is like, here, this is how it works. Like, thank you, perfect. But right now, as a
Wow.
living, breathing person, I don't know if I want to know, because I'd be kind of afraid almost of all of
Oh
that.
yeah. No,
Yeah,
I agree. That's a really good one. Wow.
let the
Wow, thank
mystery.
you.
Yeah. Hmm.
Awesome. Wait, so what's your book about?
Um. So yeah, I'm in the middle of writing the book, so I'm not even done yet.
Mm.
The research is all basically finished, but just the actual act of writing it. But my book's actually, it's about UFOs, but it's not about UFOs. It's purely on sort of the people who make up the UFO subculture, the UFO community.
Ooh.
So anyone who has sort of an interest in UFOs and explores that interest, if that's sort of
Nice.
if that's what sort of defines the UFO community, or what, like, if we sort of look at what the UFO subculture is, if that's our definition, it's the people
Mhm.
who sort of have an interest in and pursuit of the UFO question. And it's just about um, the subculture itself, and how that subculture fits with other subcultures. Is it even a subculture at all? So it's a book about people.
Mm.
It's a book about sort of the people within the UFO community. So
Nice.
I'm not really trying to answer the UFO riddle. I think that's impossible. I think,
Mhm.
but I can talk about the people, and I can talk about sort of why we believe what we believe in when it comes to UFOs, um, and why do certain people
Mm.
bring certain ideas to the table without any basis in sort of evidence,
Mhm.
and sort of maybe where the UFO community is going to kind of head in the next few years, and
Wow.
it's just about that. It's just sort of the community itself,
Well, I love
and
it.
yeah, it should be. I think it's going to be sort of an interesting read, because I'm not sure a lot of people have sort of done this type of book before. So
Well, thank you so much.
no, thank you. This has been fun.